On May 23, 1777, 43-year-old Daniel Boone stood on the ramparts of Boonesboro and watched as roughly 200 Shawnee warriors streamed out of the woods around the settlement he had founded 2 years earlier. The settlement was essentially a fort with 4 stockade walls and a guard tower at each corner. Inside, there were 26 cabins full of settlers, some of whom had joined Boone on the trek from North Carolina and others from neighboring regions. Exactly 1 month earlier, roughly 100 Shawnee warriors had attacked the settlement. Boone and 13 other men mounted a valiant defense of the compound and drove the warriors back. Boone had been shot in the ankle, and he had been hobbling ever since. His friend Simon Kenton had saved his life not once but twice during the First Battle of Boonesboro. No one had any doubt there would be a second battle, and now it was here. A series of killings and raids by both settlers and Native Americans, called Lord Dunmore's War, had plagued the frontier a couple years earlier. Now, in 1777, 13 formerly British colonies were starting the second year of a declared war of independence. Along the western frontier of the war, which was essentially the Appalachian mountain range, the British made allies of many of the Native American tribes in the region. If the British won the war, they promised to give back the land which had been taken by the American colonists. On April 24, 1777, the Shawnee had launched their first attack on Boonesboro in support of the British cause. The warriors had been repulsed, but now they had returned with double the numbers. As Daniel Boone stood on the ramparts of his fort and watched the warriors charge, he had to hope the defenders could hold up a second time. Despite being hobbled, Boone led his men to stave off wave after wave of attacks. For 2 days, between May 23rd and May 25th, the Shawnee assaulted Boonesboro. At one point, it appeared as if a Shawnee warrior might set the fort on fire, but one of Boone's old associates, a man named Michael Stoner, spotted the warrior and shot him before the warrior could put the fort to the torch. Throughout the 2 days of attacks, the Shawnee must have realized that the second battle was decidedly different from the first. A month earlier, they had caught the defenders out in the open in front of the gate to the fort. The warriors could have stormed the fort, but they chose to try to wipe out the defenders first, and it had been their undoing. Now, the defenders of Boonesboro were safely behind the stockade walls. Traditionally, Native American warriors did not conduct prolonged sieges. That was the old European style of warfare. And as the second day of the Second Battle of Boonesboro came to a close, the Shawnee warriors understood they were never going to take the fort. Dozens of warriors had been killed, while Boone lost only one man. The Shawnee retreated into the woods, and Daniel Boone and his people breathed a sigh of relief, but only temporarily. Although this siege had ended, the fighting on the Kentucky frontier was far from over. Daniel Boone was determined to protect his settlement, and the Shawnee were equally determined to destroy it. From Black Barrel Media, this is an American Frontier series on Legends of the Old West. I'm your host, Chris Wimmer, and this season we're telling the stories of 2 of America's most famous frontiersmen, Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett. This is Episode 3, Daniel Boone, Part 3, Folk Hero. At the start of summer 1777, Daniel Boone and the other settlers took a moment to assess their situation. While only one man had died during the recent siege, most of the men who were of fighting age had suffered injuries and weren't at full strength. Meanwhile, Boone's broken ankle continued to trouble him. He couldn't help but fear that the Shawnee would regroup with more numbers and attack again. But he also knew that Boonesboro wasn't alone in its plight. He received word that Boonesboro's sister settlements, Harrodsburg and Logan Station, had also been attacked. With British support, the Shawnee launched simultaneous assaults against the people they believed were encroaching on their land. They didn't care that Boone and the others had bought the land from the Cherokee. The Shawnee claimed Kentucky as theirs. Throughout the summer of 1777, The Shawnee repeatedly attacked Boonesboro, Harrodsburg, and Logan Station. At the end of the season, Boone studied the attrition. Between the three settlements, only 102 men and boys were able-bodied, but none of the settlements had fallen. Then, in the autumn of 1777, the region received support. Militiamen from Virginia and North Carolina arrived to replenish the ranks. By the time help arrived, there had been a lull in the fighting in Kentucky, and some assumed the worst was over. Much of the belief stemmed from the sudden lack of British support for the Native American tribes. British forces faced challenges up and down the colonies. The previous year, in 1776, they had battered the American Continental Army and pushed it out of New York. Only General George Washington's daring and surprising victories at Trenton and Princeton had saved the American cause. In 1777, while Daniel Boone and the settlers protected their compounds on the Kentucky frontier, the British won victories at Brandywine and Germantown, which helped them capture Philadelphia. But the British also suffered a shocking defeat at the two-part Battle of Saratoga. The war, which looked like it should have been won twice by the British, continued. As the year wore on and the weather turned colder, the British re-examined their leadership and resources. In Kentucky, Boonesboro's survival was a less heralded American success story, but it was a success story nonetheless. The British and their native allies had failed to destroy any of the American settlements in Kentucky. As a result, it seemed as if the Shawnee threat was diminishing. But then, a single spark reignited the flame. Shawnee leader Chief Cornstalk had kept his band out of the fighting. Cornstalk honored the truce made after Lord Dunmore's war, and he refused to help the British. The warriors who followed Cornstalk abided by his command to stay neutral. In November 1777, Chief Cornstalk, his son, and a handful of warriors arrived at Fort Randolph in Point Pleasant, located in present-day West Virginia. They were on a mission of peace. Cornstalk went to the fort's commander, Captain Matthew Arbuckle, to remind Arbuckle that Cornstalk's band of Shawnee were not at war. Arbuckle believed Cornstalk, but the captain decided to hold Cornstalk and the others at the fort as hostages since the rest of the Shawnee were at war. While the Shawnee were in Fort Randolph, a soldier at the fort was killed by unknown Native Americans. Details of the death aren't clear, but the other soldiers blamed Chief Cornstalk and his group. Against Captain Arbuckle's orders, soldiers burst into the cabin where the Shawnee hostages were kept and killed everyone inside. Chief Cornstalk, a moderating voice between the Shawnee and the settlers, was dead. The chief's death had immediate ripple effects throughout the region. The Shawnee as a whole had stopped many of their attacks during the autumn months. But now they were furious and wanted revenge. Early the next year, in February 1778, their vengeance fell on Daniel Boone. The winter was harsh in 1777, and supplies in Kentucky ran low. People were dying, and Daniel Boone and the other leaders made a difficult choice. To preserve food during the winter and to keep the people from starving, they needed salt. Salt was nearly as important as gunpowder, and there were a handful of salt springs in the vicinity of the settlements. But getting the salt was dangerous. The Shawnee watched the trails to the salt springs. By the turn of the new year, the need for salt was too great. On January 1st, 1778, Boone organized a 30-man expedition to a salt spring near Blue Lick. If their plan worked, they would spend a few weeks there and get enough salt for the entire year. Boone picked a particularly frosty day to venture out of Boonesboro, and he hoped the weather would keep the Shawnee warriors at their winter camp. When Boone and his men arrived at the salt spring, a handful of men immediately began to boil salt. Meanwhile, Boone and the others hunted and trapped. Over the next few weeks, Boone and his men mined the salt and saw no sign of the Shawnee. After a month at the salt spring, the settlers were nearly finished with their work. On February 7, 1778, Boone left the salt camp for one final hunt. He was incredibly lucky when he was able to kill a buffalo. He loaded hundreds of pounds of meat onto his pack horse and started the trip back to camp. That was when he heard the sound of crunching snow. Boone glanced over his shoulder and saw 4 Shawnee warriors racing in his direction. Boone reacted quickly. He tried to cut the buffalo meat off of his pack horse in order to reduce the weight and ride to safety, but his blood-stained knife was frozen in its sheath. With no other option, Boone hopped off the horse and ran into the woods. As he fled, musket balls zipped past him. One round tore the strap of his powder horn, a close call which could have blown him up. Boone knew he had a slim chance of outrunning the warriors. He was in his mid-40s, and the warriors were younger. So he stopped running and surrendered. Instead of killing Boone, the warriors took him to their leader, Chief Blackfish. Boone tried to deceive the chief and claim he was alone, but Blackfish knew Boone was lying. They had seen the men boiling salt in the woods. Fearing for his family and the under-defended people of Boonesboro, Boone made a proposal. He convinced Chief Blackfish that his men would join the Shawnee Nation. The men would take the places of warriors who had died in battle the previous year, and they would help the Shawnee fight their tribal enemies. Chief Blackfish held a council, and the council agreed to Boone's terms. They took Boone back to the salt camp, and Boone's men were shocked to see Boone being escorted by Shawnee warriors. Boone did his best to explain the situation. With no other viable options, the men threw down their weapons. Then, when Boone's men were in custody, Chief Blackfish added a provision to the deal. Technically, Boone had made a plea for his men to join the tribe, not himself. Blackfish told Boone that if he wanted to remain with his men, he would have to face a traditional Shawnee challenge. He would have to run the gauntlet. Shawnee warriors with tomahawks and clubs lined up in 2 rows facing each other. Boone would have to run down the path between them while trying to avoid being hit, though that was virtually impossible. No one escaped the gauntlet unharmed, and in some cases running the gauntlet was lethal. Boone ultimately agreed to Blackfish's demand. He lined up at one end of the gauntlet while his men watched from the side. Then he started running. Boone dodged as many blows as possible, but he started reeling as strikes found their marks. At one point, a tomahawk to the head nearly killed him, but he stayed on his feet. With blood dripping down his face, he neared the end of the gauntlet, only to see a colossal warrior step forward to deliver a death blow. But as the warrior adjusted his swing, he exposed his chest. Boone turned his body into a missile, launched himself at the warrior, and rammed the man with as much strength as he had left. The warrior, undoubtedly stunned, toppled into the snow, and Daniel Boone crossed the finish line, bloody and dazed, but alive. After surviving the gauntlet, Boone and his captured men were taken north to the Shawnee settlement of Chillicothe, located in modern-day Ohio. Although Chief Blackfish said only Boone had to run the gauntlet, the Shawnee made 2 more men run it in Chillicothe. For both experiences, women made up the gauntlet instead of warriors. Boone's men made it through, injured but alive. In essence, the gauntlet acted as an initiation ritual. Boone and his men were now Shawnee, and as part of the community, they received new names. Boone was called Sheltoe, which translated to Big Turtle. After living as Big Turtle for a month, Boone and his men accompanied Chief Blackfish to Detroit to see British Lieutenant Governor Henry Hamilton. They arrived on March 30th, 1778, and Hamilton persuaded Blackfish to exchange some captives for horses and munitions. Blackfish agreed to release the other men, but not Daniel Boone. Blackfish wanted Boone to remain with the Shawnee because he thought Boone was a good addition to the band. Of course, Boone didn't want to stay with the Shawnee. He wanted to go home, and he attempted to free himself by telling an audacious lie to Lieutenant Governor Hamilton. Daniel Boone claimed he was loyal to King George, and if he were allowed to go back to Boonesboro, he would convince the people to surrender to British forces. Hamilton seems to have believed the lie, but he didn't negotiate Boone's release from Chief Blackfish. Boone's men were headed home, but Boone was trapped with the Shawnee. After a few weeks in Detroit, Boone and the Shawnee returned to Chillicothe. As the temperature warmed in the spring, Boone lived, worked, and hunted with the Shawnee, and he grew increasingly worried that he would never see his family again. Boone regularly thought about escaping, but he waited for the right time. The moment came in June 1778. Boone discovered that Blackfish was going to break his promise. The chief planned to destroy Boonesboro. Adding insult to injury, the attack had been blessed by the British. As the sun began to rise on June 16th, Boone slipped out of the camp before anyone was awake. As he ran through the woods, he rarely rested, and he did his best to disguise his tracks from the Shawnee warriors who were likely pursuing him. According to the legend, for 3 long, arduous days, Daniel Boone ran home. He covered 150 miles of rugged territory, and he arrived at Boonesboro, southeast of the modern-day city of Lexington, on June 19th. He was exhausted and starving, but he warned the settlers about the impending attack. To his shock, he wasn't greeted with cheers or even kind words. He was arrested for treason. He had done such a good job persuading the British and the Shawnee that he had switched sides. Everyone believed it, including the people of Boonesboro. He had just survived a punishing journey through the wilderness, which would have challenged today's toughest high-endurance athletes, and his reward was to be captured as a traitor. And it got worse. Boone learned that his wife Rebecca assumed he was dead, and she had taken the family back to North Carolina. Now he would have to win a court-martial and survive a Shawnee assault before he could even think about finding his family. Daniel Boone's trial was held at Logan Station, one of the sister settlements to Boonesboro, sometime between the end of June and the end of July 1778. The settlement was named for Captain Benjamin Logan, one of Boone's friends who now believed Boone was a traitor. Another voice against Boone was even more painful. That was the voice of Colonel Richard Calloway. 2 years earlier, Boone had led the rescue mission which had returned 2 of Calloway's daughters, Elizabeth and Frances, as well as Boone's daughter Jemima, after they were captured by Shawnee warriors. Jemima Boone had then married one of Calloway's sons. Despite the deep connection between the 2 families, Calloway was quick to believe Daniel Boone had switched sides to the British and was ready to hand over the settlement which he had founded and protected for 3 years. Calloway claimed Boone was a traitor because Boone hadn't tried to return to Boonesboro sooner. Boone's many months with the Shawnee were proof that he had switched sides. During the trial, Boone served as his own counsel. He argued that he had used strategy and pragmatism to save lives. His men had not been butchered at the salt camp. They had survived capture, and they had been released. Boone himself escaped as soon as he was able. If he had really defected to the British, why would he have made a harrowing journey to warn the settlements about a British attack? It made no sense. When the trial came to a close, Boone was found not guilty. Despite his exoneration, he didn't like the fact that his loyalty had been questioned. It pained him to know that his friends and allies had questioned his commitment to the American cause and the Kentucky settlement for which he had done more than any other to build. But Boone knew he couldn't dwell on those feelings. He had not been lying about his loyalty to America and Kentucky, and he had not been lying about the impending attack by Chief Blackfish. Boone took a drastic measure to even the odds against the Shawnee. On August 1st, Boone led 19 men against a Shawnee camp called Paint Creek. Although outnumbered, the surprise attack caught a few dozen Shawnee warriors off guard. Boone's men killed several warriors, while Boone didn't lose a single man. Boone's attack forced the Shawnee to retreat. More importantly, The victory bought Boone some time to reinforce Boonesboro before Chief Blackfish could mount a full attack. Chief Blackfish and his warriors finally arrived on September 7th. Blackfish's force numbered almost 450, including Shawnee, Cherokee, Mingo, and Delaware warriors. He also had a handful of Canadian mercenaries who were loyal to the British. Blackfish believed Daniel Boone had 200 militiamen under his command. Boone successfully held the fort against all previous attacks, so Blackfish agreed to talk rather than assault the compound immediately. Boone likely had fewer than 50 men to defend the fort, but Blackfish didn't know that. Boone met with Chief Blackfish outside the fort and said the settlers would not surrender. Blackfish said the townspeople should pledge loyalty to the British in exchange for their lives. Negotiations were clearly at an impasse, and as they continued, something went awry. Details are murky, but a fight started between a settler and a Native American man. Tensions quickly escalated, and Boone and his men fled back to the fort with warriors in hot pursuit. Previously, Native American forces had not been willing to engage in a prolonged siege, but they were now. For the next several days, the two sides exchanged fire with little damage done. As the days ticked away, Chief Blackfish realized his momentum was stalling. He decided he needed to do something aggressive to gain an advantage. In the evenings, the Shawnee hurled themselves at Boonesboro with torches to try to burn the compound to the ground. Several fires caught hold, and Boone's brother, Squire Jr., led the effort to put out the flames. He converted old musket barrels into water cannons, essentially creating a water gun. And while the defenders were busy fighting fires, the attackers were employing a tactic which had been used across Europe and Asia for a couple hundred years. The Canadian mercenaries with Chief Blackfish suggested an idea to dig a tunnel under the walls of Boonesboro, pack it with barrels of gunpowder, and detonate them. The blast would explode and/or collapse part of the wall, and the attackers could storm the fort. But from the ramparts, Boone spotted the Canadians digging, and he came up with a creative solution to deal with them. Under Boone's direction, the men of Boonesboro started digging their own tunnel, under the Canadians' tunnel. The Boonesboro tunnel caused the Canadians to fear that their tunnel would collapse, and the Canadians abandoned the project. After 10 days of fighting with zero progress, Chief Blackfish withdrew his men on September 18th. When the siege of Boonesboro was done, only 2 of Boone's men died while more than 30 warriors were killed. Following the siege, Boone claimed he and his men scraped 150 pounds of lead out of the fort's walls. Chief Blackfish and his men failed in the siege, but it wasn't for lack of trying. When the siege was lifted, it would be an understatement to say Daniel Boone was physically and mentally exhausted. And yet, he badly wanted to see his family, though it would take 2 more years before he could leave Boonesboro. Finally, in 1780, he made the trek to North Carolina. Boone reunited with his wife Rebecca and the children who were still living at home. He convinced Rebecca to bring the family back to Kentucky, and their family was joined by others who wanted to travel the wilderness road to the frontier. Among the settlers in 1780 was a man named Abraham Lincoln, the grandfather of the future President of the United States. Lincoln had actually married into the Boone family when he married one of Boone's cousins. After the journey, there was no rest for the weary. While Daniel Boone had been stuck in Boonesboro after the siege, the American War of Independence took hold in the southern colonies. The British had captured Savannah, Georgia, and there were small battles throughout Georgia and South Carolina. In 1780, the war completely shifted to the south, and that summer was the lowest point of the war for the Americans. The British captured Charleston, then savaged an American column at the Battle of the Waxhaws, and then crushed the entire American Southern Army at the Battle of Camden. At the same time, Boone became a lieutenant colonel in the Virginia militia. In the summer of 1780, while the British solidified their hold on South Carolina, Boone joined an expedition to the Ohio River Valley under the command of Lieutenant Colonel George Rogers Clark. and on August 8, 1780, Clark's forces won a major victory against Native American warriors at the Battle of Pequot. Shortly after the battle, while Clark's forces continued to fight on the frontier, Daniel Boone returned to Boonesboro. For the next 2 years, he saw very little action, but during that time, the Americans changed the tide of the war. They started winning battles, and they slowly reclaimed most of South Carolina and Georgia. At the end of October 1781, the American Continental Army forced a British army under General Charles Cornwallis to surrender at Yorktown, Virginia. That was the final major engagement between the regular armies, but it wasn't the end of the fighting. A year later, in August 1782, a group of 350 British Loyalists and Native American allies snuck into eastern Kentucky and started raiding colonial settlements. Militias from various counties, including Boone and his men, responded with a call to arms. Boone suggested the militia wait for more reinforcements, but his fellow officers disagreed. They began to track down the raiding party, and they spotted it on August 19th at Licking River in northern Kentucky. Boone again proposed they wait. Not only was the militia outnumbered, but Boone feared they would walk into an ambush. Once more, he was overruled. The militiamen climbed a ravine near the river. As they neared the top, they marched into a trap. British Loyalists and various native warriors appeared out of nowhere and opened fire. The militia forces fell into disarray, and the shooting turned into hand-to-hand combat. Boone fought tenaciously and rallied his men as best he could. When it was obvious the militia was going to lose the battle, Boone provided covering fire for his retreating men, including his son Israel. Boone found a horse and urged his son to ride to safety. But before Israel could hop on, he was shot in the neck and died instantly. With enemies starting to envelop him, Boone had no choice but to leave Israel's body behind. The skirmish became known as the Battle of Blue Licks, and it was a resounding defeat for the American militia. It was one of the final engagements of the Revolutionary War, and it happened just 3 months before America and Britain signed a preliminary peace treaty. For Daniel Boone, he now had to go home and tell his wife they had lost another son. If there was any solace to be found, it came the following year. In September 1783, the British acknowledged American sovereignty. The United States had gained its independence, and Boone could finally stop soldiering for the first time in 6 years. When the war finished, Daniel Boone kept himself busy with tasks he found far more preferable than fighting. He welcomed more settlers to Kentucky and expanded the settlements he helped found. He worked as a surveyor and trader, but still found time to hunt in the Kentucky forests. In the years following the war, Boone amassed great wealth from his various jobs and business ventures. With some of that wealth, he purchased 7 slaves. And although it was said he treated them well, he still joined the group of prominent early Americans who lived in the paradoxical world of fighting for freedom while also owning slaves. Boone was an elected member of the Virginia legislature from 1781 to 1791, though he made little impact. But during that time, he began to make an impact of a different kind, and through the work of someone else. In 1784, pioneer and historian John Filson published a book called The Discovery, Settlement, and Present State of Kentucky. Daniel Boone featured heavily in Filson's book, and readers across the new nation became aware of Boone's adventures. Stories like carving out the Wilderness Road, rescuing Jemima Boone, and the siege of Boonesboro made Daniel Boone appear larger than life. Filson also helped Boone publish his popular autobiography the same year. Thanks to John Filson, Boone soon found himself making an impact as one of America's first folk heroes. Despite growing popularity in the new developing nation, Boone's life took a downturn in the 1790s. He suffered business setbacks, his debts accumulated, and his political career fizzled out. Boone decided to make a major change. In 1799, he packed up his family and moved to St. Charles, Missouri, which at the time was part of Spanish Louisiana. When he arrived in St. Charles, Boone was appointed a judge by Spanish authorities. For 5 years, Boone worked as a judge, first for the Spanish, then for the French when Missouri briefly returned to France. Then in 1804, the United States acquired Missouri as a part of the Louisiana Purchase, and Daniel Boone became a captain in the local militia at the chipper young age of 70 years old. Throughout the first decade of the 1800s, Boone lived a mostly quiet life, but the frontiersman did have one more great adventure left in him. In 1810, at 76 years old, Boone went on a long hunt with 6 men. Boone traveled a total of 2,000 miles to the west and went as far as the Yellowstone River. Like Meriwether Lewis, William Clark, and the legendary mountain men, Daniel Boone saw the expanse of the West long before homesteaders arrived. He lived for another 10 years in Missouri, spending the majority of his time hunting or with the families of his children. On September 26, 1820, Daniel Boone passed away at the age of 85. He was buried next to his wife, Rebecca, who had died 7 years earlier. 85 was positively ancient for the time and truly astounding when factored into the events of Boone's life. Thousands of miles traveled, trails blazed, settlements founded, battles fought, hardships endured, adventures survived. There would be few people in American history who could claim they accomplished more than Daniel Boone. Next time on Legends of the Old West, we'll begin the story of another famous frontiersman, Davy Crockett. Like Daniel Boone, Crockett grows up with an inherent desire to spend his days in the woods. Also like Boone, the West calls to Crockett's adventurous spirit, and he follows it to the new frontier of Texas. Davy Crockett's story begins next week on Legends of the Old West. Members of our Black Barrel Plus program receive each new season to binge all at once with no commercials, as well as exclusive bonus episodes. Sign up now through the link in the show notes or on our website, blackbarrelmedia.com, or subscribe directly on Apple Podcasts through the podcast show page. This series was written and researched by Michael Meglish. It was produced by Joe Guerra. Original music by Rob Valier. I'm Chris Wimmer. Thanks for listening.